Me to introduce to all of you our first plenary speaker, Andrew Hazel, who is a professor in the Department of Mathematics of the University of Manchester. He has worked in many different problems inspired by biological fluid mechanics, which imply solving fluid structure interactions, like for instance those taking place in the collapse and occlusion of airways in the lung. Also, in recent years, he has dedicated part of his efforts in the study of interfacial flows and instabilities. He tackles all these problems using a combination of experiments, theory, and also performing numerical simulations carried out with some of his own made numerical codes. Today, he will present the talk entitled Bubbles and Bifurcations, Nonlinear Dynamics in Multiphase Flows. Please, Andrew.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in Norwich, a city where my grandfather, 100 years ago, used to drive the cows to the cattle market, it turns out. So there is a family connection here as well. And of course, I do those things, but I don't do them alone. There's a huge number of people, many of whom are in the room, involved in this work, and the names are all here. So I need to point this way. So Jack Keeler, back there, was a postdoc with us for a while. Jack Lawless is a current PhD student. Andres Franco Gomez is another PhD student who left a few years ago. Anton Gaillard and Grégoire Lemort were also postdocs with us, as was Michael Paida. Alice, here in the room, was a postdoc, was now a colleague at Manchester, and this is all work with my long-term collaborator, Anne Jewell, who is the director of the Manchester Centre for Nonlinear Dynamics. And what I'm going to tell you about is some of the work that we've been doing over the last number of years on interfacial flows in confined geometries, in particular in Healy-Shaw cells. But I thought I'd start by reminding you all, not that I really need to remind you all, about the beautiful and interesting instabilities that can happen when you have interfaces between two immiscible fluids. So over here, we have a jet of fluid that's breaking up into droplets as it goes through air. This is the famous milk droplet splash experiment from the 30s, very widely studied since then. And this is a fountain that you can't really see the instability, unfortunately, because it's a bit dim there. I can see it more clearly here. This is in Alnwick Gardens. If you're ever up in Alnwick, I recommend going to the gardens because it has a wonderful set of hydrodynamic instabilities in its fountains. And even some of the explanations are about right. So it's worth going and having a look. But I'll also remind you that one of the reasons why considering problems with interfaces is that interfacial flows are generically nonlinear. And everything that I'm going to talk about, we will not be considering any nonlinearities in the bulk. So the Reynolds numbers of these flows are going to be 0. So there's no nonlinearity coming from the bulk fluid, but we have typically two interfacial boundary conditions. There's a kinematic condition, which says that particles on the surface stay on the surface, or in other words, the normal interface velocity, so x here is the position of the interface, t is time, n is the normal to the interface, and u is the fluid velocity. So the normal interfacial velocity matches the normal fluid velocity. And then there's a dynamic condition which says that the stress jump, so p is the pressure, across the interface is balanced. In this case, this is the normal pressure, the normal stress jump, by the surface tension multiplied by the curvature here, the gradient normal. So, which of these conditions is nonlinear? If I've said that interfacial flows are generically nonlinear. This is the interactive part where everybody jumps up and shouts out.
All of them.
Exactly, both of them. That's quite right. So it's that normal interface velocity term there that's nonlinear, because the normal, of course, is a derivative of the surface position, and then it's the surface tension term here. So what that means is that even if you don't have surface tension, and I've already said we don't care about inertia, you can get nonlinear phenomena. And I'll show you an example of what we believe is instability due entirely to this term towards the very end of the talk. So, why Healy-Shaw cells, and what are Healy-Shaw cells? Well, it's just a long tube with a rectangular cross-section that is much, much less tall than it is wide. And it's quite a useful system in which to study interfaces because you can visualize them very easily. You just look down from above and you can see the interface. And the experiments are therefore, they're relatively easy to control and visualize. We can appeal to depth-averaged models for the theory. So rather than solving three-dimensional equations, we can solve two-dimensional equations. And if we don't have any inertia, all of the nonlinearity is encompassed in the interface. So looking at the interface shape essentially tells you about the state of the system. There are a number of applications, microfluidic flows, biofluids, geophysical flows. I'm not really going to talk about those in this talk. What I'm going to try and convince you is that this is an interesting system in which to study and then try and understand at a more fundamental level nonlinear dynamics of interfaces. And interfaces in these systems can be unstable. So what we're looking at here is a very classical problem, really. So you take your Healy-Shaw cell, you fill it full of oil, you leave one end open to air, and you extract fluid from the other end, and then what happens after a little bit of initial transients is you get a symmetric, centered, steadily propagating finger. If you extract your fluid at a slow to medium flow rate. If you go faster, then you get quite disordered looking propagation like this, right? Little fingers heading off in various different directions. And there's been quite a lot of interest in recent years about how you can adjust these types of fingering patterns depending on alterations in the geometry, whether they're changes to the rigid geometry or introducing elastic boundaries and things like that. And what we thought some years ago was, well, isn't there an analogy here with a different quite famous transition from order to disorder in fluid mechanics? And so one of the questions is, can the dynamical systems ideas that have recently been applied, developed and applied to transition to turbulence in shear flows be applied to this transition as well? So why am I saying that and why is it similar? Okay, so these are figures from Reynolds' original paper. So this is pipe flow on the left. So when you have flow through a circular pipe, at low flows you have a laminar, single, stable solution. We have a single, stable, steadily propagating solution at low flows in the Healy-Shaw cell. And actually, there is a stronger analogy than that. As far as we know, this solution exists for all flow rates. And as far as we know, it's stable. Again, like the laminar problem, you have to look at the stability of this numerically, and as far as people have been bothered to compute, it's stable. So we don't know that for definite. And then as you increase the flow, when you're in the pipe, you get turbulence. When you're in the Healy-Shaw cell, you get this disordered propagation. But we argue that the Healy-Shaw problem is actually simpler because there's no bulk nonlinearity. This nonlinearity, as I've said many times, is coming only from the interface. So maybe we stand a better chance of understanding it, maybe not. And what does understanding mean anyway? That's a deeper question that we can maybe talk about later. So where I'm trying to position all this is about this idea that it's the unstable invariant objects that organize the dynamics of this system. And this is an idea that's not particularly new in nonlinear dynamics, but it's not always applied systematically everywhere. And the idea really is that the interaction of multiple unstable invariant objects is what leads to complex dynamics. So here is the very simple example to try and get everybody in the same place as me with this. So let's imagine that we have a saddle point or stagnation point, whatever you want to call it. The point being that there is a single, so this is a solution of the system. Let's say it's a steady solution for the sake of argument, or steadily propagating in our channel. And there's one attracting direction, so things are attracted towards it that way, and there's one repelling direction. So it's unstable, but not in all directions. And this blue line is called the stable manifold. It's the line, in this case, surface in high dimensions. This is just a 2D projection. along which the system is attracted towards the solution. And let's now suppose there are two other solutions, state A down here and state B up here. If you start above the line with your initial conditions, then, assuming this is the only solution around and it's stable, the system will get attracted to state B. Whereas if you start below the line, then the system will eventually end up at state A. And it's this blue line associated with the unstable solution that is actually dividing up the phase space. Okay. That's really all there is to it. But then now let's imagine that you've got lots and lots of these unstable, weakly unstable, I'll explain what that means in a moment, solutions. And we only got one stable state over here. Because these are weakly unstable, that means it's only got one or two unstable directions. It's generally attracting. What you find out is the system kind of bounces around between all of these different solutions, goes near them, goes away again, and you end up with disordered dynamics. Okay? So if there are multiple interacting saddles, or they could be more complicated invariant objects, they could be periodic solutions, they could be tori, then you can end up with complex dynamics. And that's essentially the idea. And I'm going to try and convince you that some of this is what's going on and underlying the complexity that we see in these flows in Healy-Shaw cells. Okay, so if we're interested in the transients, which we are, rather than just the steady states, we're interested in the steady states and the transients, then what's a good system to study? Well, that initial system that I showed you where you've got the air finger coming in isn't so helpful because it's very hard to see the whole interface at once. So it's much easier for these studies to think about bubbles. So we have a bubble that's sitting in our system, it's an air bubble, and we drive it by moving the viscous fluid around it. And if you you either work in the moving frame in simulations or you stick a camera above it and track along, so you're working in the moving frame, you can watch the whole time history of the evolution of this bubble. And for Stokes flow, there are really only three governing parameters. There's the channel geometry. Alpha here is the aspect ratio of the channel, so it's the width over the height, but effectively I'm taking it to mean geometry. There's the volume of the bubble, V, and then there's effectively the dimensionless speed of the system. So that's a capillary number. Mu is the viscosity of the surrounding liquid. Gamma is the surface tension. U here is the speed of the bubble. Or you can also think of a different capillary number, which is a dimensionless flow rate. So are you choosing your velocity scale to be the speed of the bubble or the average speed of the flow? And they are not the same. And that's actually what started the study of bubbles moving in confined geometries in the first place, the fact that when chemists were using tubes with bubbles in to measure the speed of the flow, they thought, well, we'll just look at the speed of the bubble and that will tell us the speed of the flow, and in fact it doesn't. That's a different story. What's going on in Healy-Shaw cells? So this is probably the last thing I'm going to talk to you about fingers. So what we already know, why is this still an interesting system to look at? What we already know is that it's actually very boring. There's a unique stable family of steadily propagating centered solutions for both fingers and bubbles when they go at finite speeds. However, what we also know is that it's quite famously degenerate in the limit of zero surface tension. And even at finite surface tension, there are a whole load of unstable, steady, and periodic solutions floating around. So this is this is some of the computations that Alice did. This is the boring, steady, symmetric solution. When I say steady, I mean steadily propagating. Should be careful. But there are also unstable symmetric solutions, and then there's a pitchfork bifurcation, and you get an asymmetric solution. And in experiments, these experiments by Yves Couder, where they perturbed the tip of the advancing finger with a small bubble that you can barely see, you get evidence of periodic solutions. And we also know, from the work of Tabling and others, that this system is very sensitive to perturbations, in particular the roughness of the glass on the plates that you've put on the top and the bottom. So there's a lot going on in this system that means there's the potential for interesting complex dynamics, which I've already shown you. The difficulty with roughness is that it's very hard to control, in some sense. So the system that we have settled upon is to introduce a controlled geometric perturbation. So we introduce a small centered rectangle here in the cross-section, and this was originally to model in a rigid way the shape of a collapsed airway. That was actually where this problem goes back to. We were trying to understand instabilities we'd seen when we were looking at flow in collapsible vessels, and to disentangle whether the effect was just due to a funny geometry or due to the fact that we had elastic walls. There's going to be no elastic walls in this talk. We're just looking at slightly funny geometry. And what the introduction of this obstacle does, and it's not very high, in typically 1–2% of the channel's height, and what I'm going to talk to you about, is it destabilizes the symmetric steadily propagating bubble. It also destabilizes the static bubble that might sit there, and you end up with multiple steady propagation modes. And of course, that's because we've got a nonlinear system. So for a certain flow rate, when we first started looking at bubbles, we found that if you go slow, your initially symmetric bubble here moves along and then becomes asymmetric. If you go fast, you get a symmetric solution, and there's always another asymmetric solution around. And I'll mention in passing that this means you could actually do passive bubble sorting, because it turns out that it's the bigger and the smaller bubbles that get removed, and those of an intermediate size, about the same width as the rail, in fact, get transported along the middle. So that was really our first look at bubbles in these systems. But, I've already alluded to this, you get a vast amount of complex dynamics. And they're driven by the interplay between the external geometry, the surface tension, and the viscosity. So this is, as far as we can tell, within experimental reproducibility, an identical system, identical bubbles. You turn on the flow, and we end up with 5 different behaviors. Let's let that loop one more time. And what you'll hopefully already see is that this is very sensitive to exactly how the bubble splits. Bubble breakup and recombination is quite crucial in some of the complex behavior that we see in this system. So, that's a relatively long introduction to why we're studying this system. And the motivating questions are really, can we understand, interpret the observed complex dynamics and instabilities in terms of these unstable invariant objects that I was mentioning earlier? Can we develop a suitable model that allows us to compute this bifurcation structure and, in particular, the unstable modes? And then, what's actually going on physically? There are very few ingredients in this system, really. There's viscosity, there's surface tension, and there's the geometry. So, what do we do? Well, what we did was we wrote a grant, and that gave us enough money to build a long channel for these transient studies. So it's a 3-meter long channel. Here's a picture of it in the lab. And it's got an inlet and an outlet where we can inject and remove fluid, the surrounding fluid. And then it's got another inlet air port here where we can inject air and create bubbles. And there's a centering device here. And you can see here's a translating camera that moves above the channel. And there's another direct connection here to the problem of turbulence in the pipe, because this is the same translating camera that Tom Mullin used when he was looking at studies of transition to turbulence in pipes. In fact, it's in about the same place where the pipe was. So those are the experiments, and I can go into much more detail, obviously, and this is the modelling approach. So if you take the Stokes equations and you depth average them across the cross-section, and you assume that the interface looks like a semicircle throughout the entire thickness of the channel, but you allow that thickness of the channel, the height of the channel, to vary with y, which is the cross-sectional coordinate, then you end up with this expression. So the gradient here is the 2D gradient when you're looking from above. So you get, this is conservation of mass. And then on the bubble boundary, we have the kinematic condition here. So R, I've stupidly changed notation, R is now the bubble position, capital R rather than X. And this is the kinematic condition, this is the dynamic condition, where you're saying that the difference in pressure, the bubble pressure and the fluid pressure, is given by the surface tension. 1 over by is the component of the curvature through the cross-section, approximated, and then kappa is the curvature when you look down on the top of this bubble. And what varying the height does is it affects the model via the equation through two different mechanisms. You've got this viscous effect here in the conservation of mass terms, and you've got the surface tension type effect here in changing the curvature. And this is done in a frame moving with the variable velocity. And this is not strictly rational in an asymptotic sense. It's arguably rational in the physical sense because we're putting in the effects of surface tension on the right-hand side. But if you were thinking of this as an asymptotic expansion in powers of 1 over alpha, where alpha is your large aspect ratio, then it's not strictly rational. Although, of course, that's under the assumption that all the other things are order 1. And, of course, you can slightly rebalance terms under certain assumptions to make these things come in if you wish to. We haven't gone to that extent. Okay, and I should point out that this model, this depth averaging, was originally introduced by Safran and Taylor, and it was Safran and McLean in '81 who added the surface tension on the right-hand side of the dynamic condition and showed that it agreed well with experiments for the case when you don't have obstacles, you don't have these rails in Healy-Shore cells. So we solve this numerically generally, discretize the pressure with quadratic finite elements and implement it in UNCLIB, the open source library that I've spent a lot of time with many others, again, Matthias Heil and many students and postdocs working on. The weak formulation is similar to the Poisson equation and the mesh deforms of the interface. And I should, of course, at this point point out that Alice, I say we, Alice did most of the implementation of this originally, and then Jack did a lot more. Is the model any good? Well, one thing I can tell you, and this goes back to work that was done with Alberto de Lothar, with Anne and myself, is that if you now return to the finger problem, so we've got a finger propagating in these Healy-Shore cells, lambda, so you let it propagate steadily and you measure the width. So across the bottom here we have a slightly modified capillary number. It's the capillary number multiplied by the aspect ratio squared. This is the finger width. The solid lines are results of 3D Stokes simulations with the interface for increasing values of the aspect ratio. So the black line is for a square and then increasing aspect ratio as we move on. And the dots are the results from the McLean and Safman calculations. They very helpfully tabulate their results in their paper. And what we conclude from this is that you get quantitative agreement between this model in the absence of an obstacle when your aspect ratio is bigger than 8. So once you're 8 or beyond, you've got a wide enough channel that this depth average model seems to do a pretty good job. The reason why the curves are deviating at the end here are actually finite length effects in the three-dimensional calculations rather than any particular problem with the 2D model. It's a 3D error. There are problems with this model. You can't impose a no-slip boundary condition, only non-penetration, although one could think about extending that in the standard Brinkman-type way to do that. We have chosen to ignore the thin films above and below the bubble in this particular model. You can put them in, and there are other situations where you need to put them in. The difficulty is that means that you need to know what the film, you need to have a model to tell you what the film thickness above and below the bubble should be. And when you've got multiple possible solutions, you can end up with the model driving the overall behavior. So ultimately, the solution to this is to do 3D calculations, which we have not done. It also ignores the correction to the curvature to account for the fact that this bubble is really a pancake shaped. There's a dimple or section. And yet, it appears to capture the qualitative behaviours of the system, as far as we know, and it's quantitative for sufficiently large alpha, so that's aspect ratio, sufficiently large bubble volumes, and small enough flow rates. And here are some overlays of experimental results in blue and simulation results in black, other way around, sorry, simulation in blue, experiments in black, from an earlier paper. It's not always quantitative, but it is always, as far as we can tell, qualitative. The essential physics appears to be in there. So what does it do? Well, I've already explained this through the experiments. This rail introduces bistability for a fixed bubble size. So we end up with, there's an asymmetric black steadily propagating mode. There's a symmetric mode here that becomes unstable. That's what the dashed lines mean. And there's a disconnected stable solution. And up here, we have bistability. And if you increase the flow rate yet further, then you get a more complex situation where there are Hopf bifurcations that give rise to unstable and stable periodic orbits and a whole load of messy solutions going on around here. And I don't really want you to take in the full detail of this picture. It's just to show it's a mess, there's lots going on. Because the other thing that I want to remind you is the importance of the bubble breakup. I've already shown you a video illustrating that bubble breakup occurs in experiments. Bubble breakup can occur on the way in transitions between these different solutions.
Is it real time?
Yes, pretty much. I think it might, no, yeah. Nice. And so that's a bit annoying because originally we thought, well, we want to understand the behavior of a single bubble, but it turns out that you can't actually understand the behavior of a single bubble fully without knowing a bit about the dynamics of multiple interacting bubbles. So what have I told you so far? What I've told you so far is that air bubbles driven through Healy-Shaw cells with this rail, small obstacle, exhibits complex dynamics. You get multiple solutions, symmetry breaking oscillations, and regions where you can't tell what's going on. This is in contrast to the case without the rail, where you get this single steadily propagating centered bubble. The depth average model is in good. We can argue about what good means, agree with the experiments. We can explore unstable solutions with our numerical solution. There's a really interesting mathematical point here that I haven't fully, others may have, I haven't fully understood how best to analyze, which is that the solution structure is changing with time. We're not changing any other parameters, but as the system evolves, new solutions come and go, and we'll see a bit more evidence of that later on. But this motivating question is still there. Are these complex dynamics orchestrated by the weakly unstable solutions? And this is just a reminder that by weakly, I mean there's a small number of unstable eigendirections, i.e. these solutions are generally attractive. There are just a couple of directions along which the system can escape. So what I'm going to do with the rest of my time is just take you through a few different case studies to try and convince you or explain how these unstable solutions can organize the dynamics. And the first one of these, we'll see how many I get through, the first one of these is where the interesting object is an unstable periodic orbit, but we only have a single bubble. So here's a reminder of that reasonably horrendous bifurcation diagram, and we're going to focus in on this area around here. So there is a Hopf bifurcation from, this is a symmetric solution branch. And in fact, so this is a subcritical Hopf bifurcation. You get an unstable periodic orbit arising from it in the model. Let's be clear, it is a model in the model. So in order to try and see some evidence of that experimentally, we perturb the system in that region. And the way that we do that is to put a washer on one wall. So hopefully this will work. I'm now going to show you 5 different videos where we're applying the same perturbation. We've got the same bubble coming through. So look at the top. it hits the washer, it's perturbed, it wobbles, it comes back to where it was. The next one hits the washer, wobbles around, and then becomes asymmetric. So the next one becomes asymmetric on the other side. The next one splits into two and separates. And the last one splits into two and then merges. So this is all to do with exactly how the bubble splits, if it does, as it gets perturbed by this obstacle. So I'll just let those run through one more time. Okay. So the same experimental perturbation leads to multiple different outcomes. And what we've got up here is an overlay, a composite overlay of all those different videos. And then down here, this is an overlay of the motion of the bubble's centroid in the vertical, the cross-channel direction, as a function of time. And initially, the motion is the same, broadly speaking, and then it separates. So this is where it goes off to a steady asymmetric solution on the other side. Stars are where it breaks up. And so a question is this oscillatory response actually the unstable periodic orbit? Is the system initially being attracted towards this unstable periodic orbit and then flying off? Well, we can't say completely definitively, but here's a sketch of what's going on in the model and the bifurcation diagram. So we have this Hopf bifurcation where you get an unstable periodic orbit and then eventually it dies. And this is the region where things are unpredictable and you need a large, so you can probably just about see this is a small washer, this is a bigger washer. You need a bigger washer to perturb the system into interesting behavior as you move further away from the putative Hopf bifurcation. And if we then compare what that unstable Hopf bifurcation looks like in the simulations and what we see in the models, well, eye of faith, is it the same, is it not? It's broadly similar. But if we now start perturbing this unstable periodic orbit in the simulations, we get essentially the same response as the experiments. Okay, it starts off initially the same, and then it can go to the asymmetric solutions or to break up. We just stop the simulations when the bubble starts to intersect itself rather than breaking up. So we claim that this unstable periodic orbit is the edge state dividing the phase plane between the symmetric state and the other solutions. And the phase plane picture is like this. Here's the symmetric solution sitting in the middle. The unstable periodic orbit is around it, so this phase plane is the centroid position versus the time derivative of the centroid position across the channel. And this is now a zoom in of this region near the unstable periodic orbit. So each of the different colors has a different fate, if you like, and they are pretty dense. So small changes in initial conditions means you get wildly different responses. This is a similar plot of the experimental time traces, showing essentially similar behavior. And so what's going on is the reason why we believe there's unpredictability in this region is you've got multiple solutions. There have to be multiple solutions, otherwise it's not unpredictable. And then you've got this unstable periodic orbit that means if you perturb the system so it's near it, it whirls round and round and round and round and then flies off in some direction that is sensitively dependent on those initial conditions. And exactly where it ends up depends on how your multiple solutions sit in the phase plane, in the energy landscape, if you like. Now, breakup is another thing that flows into the mix, because in some of those paths, the bubble breaks up, and in others, it doesn't. So that was case study 1, doing all right. Case study 2 is to now think about an unstable steadily propagating mode, and in this case, we've got 2 bubbles. So what do you need to know about 2 bubbles? Well, what you need to know about 2 bubbles is that larger bubbles are faster. So if you stick a larger bubble ahead of a smaller bubble, sufficiently far ahead, then they will separate because the larger bubble goes faster. But if you stick the larger bubble not too far ahead of the smaller bubble, then they will aggregate. And so the question is, what happens in between? So if we now turn to the simulations, so we've just said that, the two bubbles far apart will separate. So if we plot their motion, where here this is now the separation distance between the two bubbles on the bottom and the center of mass of the two bubbles, so they're started one above the other, these two bubbles will separate. If you put two bubbles closer together, they will coalesce, aggregate. And if we use, this is essentially a technique known as edge tracking, it's bisection, choosing a suitably sensible direction in which to bisect, we find that there is an unstable, steadily propagating two-bubble state that divides these two situations. This was for bubbles that were asymmetric off the edge of the rail. We can repeat the same process with symmetric bubbles, and we find another symmetric, unstable two-bubble edge state. And then in between, there's actually breakup. This is the complicated three-bubble zone where things break up. So, and I know I'm rushing through this relatively quickly, so apologies for that, but the point being that these unstable, two of them, steadily propagating solutions, divide the phase space. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they're at very similar distances apart. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's something interesting going on because the solution structure evolves with time. So this is now an example, it's going to be a video, where initially we have one bubble, it's going to break up, and then the two bubble edge states are going to influence the dynamics. So we start with a slow flow. The bubble breaks up. There is then this weakly unstable edge state that initially attracts the bubbles. Then one bubble moves over the rail, and eventually they aggregate. Now we move to a faster flow. There we go. The bubbles break up. Now there's another weakly unstable edge state, the red one that you can barely see, and that separates the bubbles. Its stable manifold is such that it prevents the bubbles from coming together and merging. So it has an effect on the overall dynamics, and it wasn't there at the start of the evolution. Oh, yes. So that was what I wanted to say about that, and the summary conclusion is we've now had two different cases where these unstable solutions are influencing the dynamics. The final thing that I'd like to talk to you about is multiple bubbles. And lots of people have studied multiple bubbles in helioshore cells that are tilted up slightly, so you have buoyancy. And the result is true whether you do that or whether you drive it with a flow rate. All pairs of non-identical bubbles, when you have an unoccluded helioshore cell, will either separate or aggregate. And the question is it actually possible to get a non-trivial, stable, multiple bubble steady state once we've put this rail in? So the answer is yes, if there are stable two-bubble steady states. Everything I've shown you have been unstable, weakly unstable two-bubble steady states. But it turns out that if you put the bubbles on opposite sides of the rail, I'm going to fly through that one. If you put bubbles on opposite sides of the rail, you can get a steadily propagating state. And in fact, it's basically the leading bubble. The leading bubble has to be the smaller bubble because it's slower. And the whole solution moves at the same speed as the single bubble. So those are the results there for the single bubble and the two bubble state. Basically, the leading bubble doesn't really change, and the trailing bubbles' position and shape are adjusted in such a way that its speed matches, and this whole thing can propagate as a coherent unit. And so once you've got two, you can play this same trick of edge tracking and get 3 and 4 and 5. And what we found is that you can get multiple bubble states if all of your the leading bubble has to be the smallest, and then the bubbles have to lie in alternation. But you get what is effectively a factorially increasing number of possible solutions. Not for all bubble volumes, but for a fairly broad range of bubble volumes, you can get these solutions. And what that means is that these small bubbles, that if these states weren't there, they'd either get aggregated as the large bubbles come behind and eat them up, or get overtaken, can be transported along with the rest of your bubble train. So that's potentially of use if you can't generate completely reliable bubble sizes, possibly. So we come to my final point. One of the interesting things about putting these multiple bubble states is, and this is what Couder did, that leading bubble you can think of as effectively applying a constant perturbation to the bubble behind. Right? It's always there doing something to that bubble behind. And if you have a large enough bubble, then we find out that it can induce stable oscillations. And there's no inertia in this system, which is one of the things people think about when they think about oscillations. So what's the mechanism for these oscillations? Well, in some sense, the answer is simple. Where's the only time derivative in these equations in this system? You have to think back to what I showed you right at the beginning. We've got two boundary conditions. There's a kinematic condition and a dynamic condition, and the only time derivative is in the kinematic condition. The thing about this system that can make it very counterintuitive is we're not driving at fixed pressure, we are driving at fixed flow rate. So this bubble is always going to try to return to its steadily propagating state. There's a natural return mechanism, if you like. So then the question is, if there's a natural return mechanism, what causes the bubble to develop these fingers to split in the first place? Well, that's just standard viscous fingering. The setup of the system is such that the interface behind becomes flat, it's slightly inclined, but if it's large enough and flat enough, it will be susceptible to viscous fingering. You get a little fjord developing that gets swept along the bubble because the bubble is not moving at the same speed as the fluid, as I already said. And then the bubble the other part of the interface tries to return to its steadily propagating state, and the cycle begins again. And this is a totally generic mechanism. It'll operate provided the bubble tip is sufficiently flat, the Capilli number is sufficiently high, so that the surface tension can't restore those perturbations. And it's entirely viscous. Surface tension is really only playing a passive role here. It's the nonlinearity in the kinematic condition that's crucial. There was another instability that we found many years ago where it's really driven by the change in curvature that's induced by the presence of this rail. And what that means is that it will work. These are now unoccluded Healy-Shaw cells, and we end up with very complicated dynamics. So are these disordered states via a series of unstable periodic orbits? We don't know yet, but we can hopefully start to understand this complex behavior in the unoccluded Healy-Shaw cell by using these dynamical systems ideas. And that's where I wanted to finish. So I will leave you with the conclusions. Thank you for your attention, and be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the excellent talk. So it's now time for questions. Okay.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering whether you did any studies at non-zero Reynolds number.
So obviously the experiments aren't really zero Reynolds number, it's very, very small. So the short answer is No, not systematically. We have done some of the higher flow rate experiments. The Reynolds number is not quite zero, and there are some situations where we think inertial effects are starting to matter, but not systematically, no.
Thank you. So,
Maybe I can speak. You have drawn an analogy at the beginning with the transition to turbulence.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, you have burst of turbulence that appears and
Exactly.
disappears. What will be the equivalent of that in your system?
So the equivalent of that in the system would be transient exploration of these things, so transient wiggles, and then it settles back to the steadily propagating finger.
Which you observe here?
Which so I mean, I think I've chosen videos not to show it. But yes, when you look at this system, I haven't got the video. If the bubble is a different size, you end up with a little bit of wiggling like this, and then it either settles down to the steady state or the asymmetric state. So I think that's the interesting thing about the finger problem, is that when you're in the lab frame, it's left the interface behind. That's the time history of the evolution. And arguably, each one of those little side fingers is a transient exploration of one of these unstable states until it settles down. So that's what we think is going on. But I won't be able to say anything more convincing until we've actually got evidence that there are unstable periodic orbits in this system, which we don't yet know. There's a student working on it, and that would just be in the model. But yeah, maybe I can talk to you more about that later.
I think there is time for a very short question.
So it looked like your first case study, they all left the periodic orbit at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, roughly.
And why?
That's right. That's a great question. I don't know. My guess at the moment, having not thought about it too deeply, is that because we're applying the same perturbation, they go to about the same distance to the periodic orbit. They're just coming in at slightly different phases. Mm-hmm. And so then if they're moving round and separating with the same sort of speed, you'd expect them to leave at the same sort of time, just in different bits. But I don't know, actually. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to our plenary speaker. So let's thank Andrew again, please.